mother and daughter is often celebrated as sacred and unbreakable. But what happens when that bond twists into something unrecognizable? When the person meant to provide care becomes the ultimate betrayer? In Prince George's County, Maryland, this question became a horrifying reality when 46-year-old Candace Craig not only took her 71-year-old mother's life, but dismembered her body with a chainsaw and attempted to destroy the evidence on a backyard grill. The gruesome details of this case force us to confront the darkest corners of human behavior. A mother killed by her only child, a body desecrated, a family shattered beyond repair. What drives someone to commit such an unthinkable act against their own flesh and blood? What invisible line was crossed that transformed a woman with no criminal history into someone capable of such calculated brutality? And most disturbingly, could this happen in any family? If you're disturbed by this case, you should be. Stay with me as we unravel not just what happened, but why. Understanding these tragic stories isn't about morbid curiosity. It's about recognizing warning signs that could protect you or someone you love from becoming the next victim of familial violence. Candace Craig appeared, by all outward measures, to be an ordinary woman. Raised in a stable two-parent household with access to good education, she had no criminal record, not even a serious traffic violation. Her mother, Margaret Craig, affectionately known as Auntie Joyce among family members, had immigrated from Trinidad and Tobago and built a respectable life as a nurse in America. After suffering a stroke that left her unstable on her feet, the 71-year-old became dependent on her only child for care and support. The mother and daughter shared a home in the Landover area of Prince George's County, Maryland, where they lived with Candace's 3 daughters. To neighbors and casual observers, they might have seemed like a multi-generational family, making the best of difficult circumstances. But behind closed doors, a sinister dynamic was developing. By May 2023, what began as financial exploitation had escalated beyond anything anyone could have imagined. Margaret's Social Security checks and pension funds were disappearing, her bank accounts mysteriously drained. When she finally confronted her daughter about the missing money, the stage was set for a confrontation that would end in one of the most shocking crimes Maryland had seen in years. This case transcends mere shock value. It represents a devastating example of elder abuse, a growing epidemic that often remains hidden behind closed doors. According to the National Council on Aging, approximately 1 in 10 Americans aged 60 and older have experienced some form of elder abuse, with financial exploitation being the most common form. Even more alarming, studies suggest that for every reported case, as many as 23 cases go unreported. What makes Margaret Craig's murder particularly significant is how it illustrates the dangerous escalation pattern that can develop. Elder abuse rarely begins with violence. It typically starts with smaller boundary violations that gradually intensify. Financial exploitation, like what Candace perpetrated against her mother, is often the gateway to more severe forms of abuse. When the victim threatens to expose the exploitation, as Margaret did, the perpetrator may resort to extreme measures to avoid consequences. The case also highlights the vulnerability of stroke survivors and others with physical limitations who become dependent on caregivers. Margaret's reduced mobility made her an easier target and limited her ability to seek help. This tragic story serves as a stark reminder that elder abuse can happen in any family, regardless of background, education, or prior criminal history, and that financial crimes against the elderly can escalate to violence with frightening speed. Margaret Craig's story began far from a Maryland suburb, where it would tragically end. Born and raised in the vibrant dual-island nation of Trinidad and Tobago, she grew up surrounded by the rich cultural tapestry of the Caribbean. Friends and family described her as outspoken and generous, with a warm personality that drew people to her. Known affectionately as Auntie Joyce to her extended family, she embodied the role of family matriarch, respected, loved, and central to family gatherings and traditions. Like many immigrants seeking opportunity, Margaret made the journey to the United States, bringing with her a strong work ethic and determination. She built a career in nursing, a profession that perfectly matched her nurturing nature and desire to help others. For decades, she cared for patients with compassion and skill, establishing herself as a dedicated healthcare professional. Her colleagues remembered her as thorough and patient-focused, someone who went above and beyond for those in her care. Family was always at the center of Margaret's life. Though Candace was her only biological child, she maintained close relationships with extended family members, serving as a source of wisdom and support. She was the kind of aunt who remembered birthdays, celebrated achievements, and offered guidance during difficult times. Her home was often a gathering place, filled with laughter, Caribbean food, and stories of home. Everything changed when Margaret suffered a debilitating stroke in her late 60s. The woman who had spent her life caring for others suddenly found herself dependent on care. The stroke left her with limited mobility, making it difficult to walk steadily or perform many daily tasks independently. This physical vulnerability would ultimately place her in a position of dependency that would be exploited in the worst possible way. Following her stroke, Margaret's independent life underwent a profound transformation. Unable to safely live alone, she moved in with her daughter Candace and her 3 granddaughters in their Landover home. What should have been a compassionate arrangement, a daughter caring for her aging mother, instead became the setting for escalating exploitation. Daily life for Margaret became increasingly restricted. Simple tasks like bathing, preparing meals, and moving around the house now required assistance. Court records would later reveal that Candace wasn't providing adequate care, Margaret wasn't being fed regularly, and her basic needs were often neglected. The home that should have been her sanctuary became her prison.
First at 5, a woman accused of helping her mother kill and dismember her grandmother takes the stand. Thank you for joining us as we continue our coverage of this dramatic trial. I'm Scott Thuman.
And I'm Michelle Marsh. We're going to get right out to Maryland Bureau Chief Brad Bell. He's been in court all day. And Brad, you've been providing updates all day long for our online audience. But I got to say, this is such a disturbing case. And you saw a lot of emotional responses today in court.
Yeah, we did. And before I get into this telling of the story, we should tell people some of these details are a little disturbing. So look, we reported on this murder when it happened back in 2023, and the details were absolutely stunning. That a grandmother was killed in her own home, that her body was kept, and then that her daughter, who allegedly did the murder, cut the body up, tried to burn it on a grill. So now that woman is on trial. Her name is Candace Craig. Her mother's name was Margaret Craig. Her daughter, we should say, Candace Craig's daughter, Celia Hardy, was charged with accessory after the fact, and she has pleaded guilty. And in exchange for a potentially lighter sentence, she agreed to testify, and she storage bin, the kind that you would put your summer clothes in for winter storage. And she said the grandmother had a plastic bag over her head. And then she said her mother did it because Grandma found out that the mother was stealing from Grandma's bank account. And so, this young woman on the stand today describing their efforts to dispose of the body. She says that they kept it in this plastic bin for a couple of days and then dragged it out to the woods out back, poured gasoline over the woman to try to dispose of the body, but the fire spread and all of the neighbors came running out with buckets of water to put it out. The fire department came. Somehow they were able to conceal the fact that it was the grandmother that they were trying to burn. And then they say that they waited for her to cool off, brought her back into the house for storage, and that Candace Craig actually went on Amazon, ordered an electric chainsaw that was delivered overnight. The daughter says she woke up the next morning and saw that the mother was already cutting up the grandmother, and that is where they ended for the day.
What began as occasional borrowing evolved into systematic theft. Candace regularly diverted her mother's Social Security checks and pension payments into her own accounts, effectively stealing the financial security Margaret had worked decades to build. Court records revealed the sophisticated methods Candace employed to maintain access to her mother's funds. She would intercept mail containing financial statements and redirect communications from Margaret's bank. Most disturbing was her manipulation of her 12-year-old daughter, whom she coached to impersonate Margaret on calls with financial institutions to request new debit cards when the old ones were canceled due to suspicious activity. As Margaret's physical condition deteriorated, Candace's control over her finances tightened. Bank records showed frequent withdrawals that couldn't be accounted for in Margaret's care or living expenses. While Margaret struggled with inadequate food and care, these funds supported Candace's lifestyle. The financial abuse created a power dynamic that silenced Margaret's complaints. Without access to her own money, she became even more dependent on her daughter. The exploitation reached its breaking point when Margaret discovered unauthorized charges and missing funds. When confronted with evidence of her theft, Candace faced a choice: face legal consequences for financial fraud or silence the only witness. Her decision would transform financial exploitation into something far more sinister. The 71-year-old woman, despite her physical limitations, summoned the courage to confront her daughter. According to court testimony, on May 23, 2023, Margaret threatened to report Candace to the authorities for fraudulent use of her credit card. It was a moment of desperate self-advocacy from a vulnerable woman who had discovered the betrayal of her only child. For Margaret, this was about more than money. It was about dignity and justice after months of exploitation. Candace's reaction to this threat revealed the true nature of her character. Rather than showing remorse or attempting to make amends, she saw her mother not as a parent deserving of respect, but as a threat to be eliminated. The prospect of criminal charges for financial fraud, which might have resulted in probation or minimal jail time, was enough to trigger a lethal response. In that moment, Candace made the calculation that her mother's life was worth less than avoiding consequences for her crimes. The medical examiner would later determine that Margaret Craig died by homicide through suffocation. According to prosecutors, Candace grabbed a plastic trash bag and forcibly placed it over her mother's head. Margaret, already physically compromised from her stroke, had little chance to defend herself against her daughter's attack. The murder occurred in the family home on Hill Road, the very place where Margaret should have been safest. The calculated nature of the killing was evident in Candace's actions. She chose a method that would leave minimal evidence and took advantage of her mother's physical vulnerability. There were no signs of hesitation or remorse in the immediate aftermath. Instead, Candace moved directly into planning how to dispose of her mother's body and create an alibi. The timeline reconstructed by investigators showed that the murder occurred in the afternoon of May 23rd. For the next several hours, Candace remained in the house with her mother's body, methodically planning her next steps. She did not call for medical help or report her mother's death. Instead, she began considering how to make Margaret's body, and the evidence of her crime, disappear permanently. This period of calm planning after such a violent act demonstrated a chilling detachment that would shock even veteran homicide detectives. With her mother dead, Candace faced the problem of disposing of the body. Her initial attempts focused on concealment, wrapping Margaret's body and moving it to the basement of the home. Officers discovered a blue storage bin containing dismembered human remains. The body of Margaret Craig had been cut into pieces with a chainsaw in a gruesome attempt to dispose of evidence. The basement showed signs of hasty cleaning, but blood evidence remained detectable to crime scene technicians using specialized equipment and chemical tests. Forensic investigators faced extraordinary challenges processing the scene. The dismemberment complicated identification, though dental records would later confirm the remains belonged to Margaret. The condition of the body parts indicated attempts at burning, with some showing char marks consistent with exposure to high heat. Outside, investigators found the family grill with human tissue residue and a fire pit in the backyard, containing additional evidence. The house yielded a timeline of horror: bloodstains in multiple rooms, cleaning supplies hastily put away, and the chainsaw itself still containing trace evidence, found in the garage. Crime scene technicians worked methodically for days, documenting each piece of evidence. They collected blood samples, fingerprints, the chainsaw, cleaning supplies, and the contents of the home's drains, which contained additional biological evidence. The meticulous work of these investigators would prove crucial in building an airtight case against Candace Craig. Based on the overwhelming physical evidence found in the home, police arrested Candace Craig immediately. Her daughter, Salia Hardy, was taken into custody shortly thereafter when evidence suggested she had assisted in the attempted cover-up. The arrests shocked the Landover community, where the family had lived quietly for years without drawing attention. Prosecutors moved quickly to file charges. Candace Craig was charged with first-degree murder, second-degree murder, tampering with evidence, and disposing of a body in an unauthorized location. The severity and number of charges reflected both the heinous nature of the crime and the prosecutor's confidence in their evidence. Salia Hardy faced the lesser but still serious charge of being an accessory after the fact to murder. The case was assigned to the Prince George's County State's Attorney's Office's Homicide Unit, where prosecutors began the painstaking process of organizing the substantial physical evidence, witness statements, and financial records that would tell the complete story of Margaret Craig's exploitation and murder. During interrogation, investigators made a disturbing discovery about Candace's character. She attempted to shift blame to her own children. She told detectives that her middle daughter was responsible for Margaret's death and that Salia had willingly participated in the cover-up. This attempt to sacrifice her children to save herself failed as forensic evidence clearly pointed to Candace as the killer. Financial investigation revealed the extent of Candace's theft. Thousands of dollars had been systematically drained from Margaret's accounts over months. Bank surveillance footage showed Candace using her mother's debit card at ATMs, providing the clear financial motive that prosecutors would emphasize at trial. This combination of physical evidence and financial records created an overwhelming case. The trial of Candace Craig began in the fall of 2023 in the Prince George's County Circuit Court. For 8 grueling days, prosecutors methodically presented their case, weaving together forensic evidence, financial records, and witness testimony to create a comprehensive picture of exploitation, murder, and cover-up. The jury listened as medical examiners detailed the manner of Margaret's death and the subsequent dismemberment of her body, testimony so graphic that several jurors visibly struggled to maintain composure. Financial experts traced the pattern of theft from Margaret's accounts, establishing the motive for murder. Bank records showed systematic withdrawals that coincided with Candace gaining control over her mother's finances. Surveillance footage from ATMs captured Candace using her mother's debit card on multiple occasions. Defense attorneys attempted to create reasonable doubt by suggesting alternative scenarios and questioning the timeline established by prosecutors. However, the physical evidence proved overwhelming. After the closing arguments, the jury deliberated for less than 6 hours, a remarkably short time given the complexity of the case, before reaching their decision. Their quick deliberation signaled the strength of the prosecution's case. On a Friday afternoon in November 2023, the jury returned with their verdict: guilty on all counts. Candace Craig stood emotionless as the forewoman read the convictions for first-degree murder, second-degree murder, tampering with evidence, and disposing of a body in an unauthorized location. The courtroom remained silent except for muffled sobs from family members who had lost Margaret and would now lose Candace to the prison system. At the sentencing hearing in January 2024, Judge Karen Mason delivered the maximum penalty: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. In her remarks, Judge Mason highlighted the particularly troubling aspects of the case: the absence of mitigating factors in Candace's background, the betrayal of a vulnerable mother, and the calculated nature of both the murder and cover-up. What we have here, Judge Mason noted, is a woman who led a good life and left this world in such a way, and only you know, Ms. Craig, exactly what happened here. In contrast, Salia Hardy received a more lenient sentence after pleading guilty to being an accessory after the fact. The court recognized her as another victim of her mother's manipulation and sentenced her to time served, acknowledging the coercive circumstances of her involvement. This differentiated response reflected the justice system's attempt to assign appropriate accountability while recognizing the complex family dynamics at play. The ripple effects of Margaret Craig's murder devastated her extended family. At the sentencing hearing, a family member delivered a heart-wrenching victim impact statement describing Auntie Joyce as the heart of their family, a generous, outspoken woman whose violent end they could never have imagined. The family now faced the impossible task of reconciling their memories of Margaret with the horrific details of her death. Perhaps most poignant was the presence of Candace's 3 daughters at the sentencing, sitting silently in the back row of the courtroom as their mother received her life sentence. These young women had lost their grandmother to murder and their mother to prison. The youngest, just 12, had been manipulated into participating in the financial fraud. The middle daughter had been falsely accused by her own mother, and Salia, the eldest, carried the trauma of discovering her grandmother's remains and being coerced into the cover-up. The psychological wounds inflicted on this family would require years of healing, with some scars likely to remain permanent. While the life sentence without parole reflects the severity of Candace's crimes, can any punishment truly deliver justice for such a profound betrayal? The criminal justice system can remove dangerous individuals from society, but it cannot restore what was lost: a mother's life, a family's trust, and the innocence of 3 young women caught in unimaginable circumstances. The murder of Margaret Craig represents a tragic failure of familial trust. What began as financial exploitation escalated to the ultimate betrayal when Candace chose to silence her mother rather than face consequences for her theft. This preventable tragedy reminds us that elder abuse often escalates gradually, with deadly consequences when intervention comes too late. If this case affected you, please like and share to raise awareness about elder abuse. Subscribe to Explosive True Crime Stories for more in-depth analyses of cases that teach vital safety lessons. Comment below with cases you'd like us to cover.